Welcome to the Underdog Sniper Podcast. I'm your host, MGCovers. This is episode 35. Happy Monday to you. Greatly appreciate you tuning in. If you're watching this live on YouTube or you're listening to it on Spotify or Apple iTunes, greatly appreciate you taking time out of your day to listen to this podcast. Let's dive into the outline for this week's podcast. First off, we're going to talk about NBA. I'm handicapping it slightly different. Didn't make any changes to the model, but my approach to the model, which I've mentioned numerous times, can impact your results and profitability. So I'll talk about those changes that I've made. Secondly, we're going to talk about a concept called the dead wager concept. Now, this is really cool. This was previously a coaching video that I only made available to clients. We're going to talk about it on this podcast for what it is and why you should avoid the dead wager. We're going to talk about NFL. We've had a ton of success here in the last 3 weeks. We'll review that briefly. And then finally, we'll talk about my goals unit-wise, where I'm at now on November the 18th, 2024, and my goals and how I want to finish for the rest of the year. Okay, so let's I'm going to dive right into this dead wager concept. Now, dead wager concept, this is something that I have coined, meaning like you won't hear other handicappers talk about the dead wager concept. And what the dead wager concept is, let me explain this scenario and then you'll understand it. Okay, so we started out the day, we had Indianapolis. We wagered basically what I call a third unit. Now, money-wise, one full unit's $1,000, so 1/3 unit for me would be $333. This is not units when I'm calculating my betting log. This is units and how I'm managing my money. So we wagered 1/3 unit at plus 184. That was before the game at 12:45. Then Indianapolis went up 13-0, and I was looking to hedge. Not looking to hedge this, but I was aware that, hey, if Indianapolis does get a lead, we want to secure a winning day or a winning bet by hedging this. And you'll see that, I guess that was it was right before halftime because I know the Jets scored. So they were 13-0. I could get it for live wager for Jets at plus 332. And I wagered $100. I want to explain this. Now, the reason I wagered only 100, which is 1/10 unit for me. So if I win that wager for the Jets, somehow the Jets were to come back and win, I would win 332. I had wagered 333, so that would cancel out that wager, and I would basically break even. So with this scenario, you could see that's basically the message I left for clients there. Hey, I'm just wagering enough to cover the previous bet, so I can't lose. Now on the surface, this looks like a really good hedge, right? If Indianapolis hangs on to win, and their win probability at that point up 13-0 was probably extremely high, maybe like 85%. So if Indianapolis hangs on to win, which would be the most likely scenario, we would win roughly $600 minus the $100 we wagered on the Jets, and we would clear $500 on that particular wager. Now, this is actually an example of a dead wager. Because let's say the Jets come back. They did come back. They could have easily won that game. Indianapolis had a late score. Jets could have easily won that game. And if the Jets win, I basically make $0. So now I'm going to finally define what a dead wager is. A dead wager is when you risk money and the best case scenario is to break even. That is a dead wager. I'll give you another example of a dead wager. Let's say during the course of a day, you're down, let's say you're down $100 and you have one wager left for that day. If you wager $100 on that last play, that is an example of a dead wager. You should at least, depending on how you structure your units, you should at least wager maybe $120 on that last wager. Why? Because if you win that wager, you will have a profitable day. This is a business, and the whole premise and purpose of a business is to turn a profit. You say, well, if we wagered 120 and it loses, now you're in the hole 220. Yeah, but at least you're giving yourself a chance to turn a profit. If you wagered the exact amount that you've lost for that day, the best case scenario is you're going to break even. And forget sports betting, for instance, and let me give you an outside example. Let's say you own a business and you have a business partner and you're getting ready to spend money on the business. And you tell your business partner, hey, I'm getting ready to spend X amount of dollars on the business. And the worst case scenario is we're going to lose this money. And he asks you the question, what is the best case scenario if everything goes right? And you tell him, well, the best case scenario, we would break even. Why are you investing money into something when the best case scenario is to break even? And the way I've ran my sports betting career is I've always, and a lot of this comes from how I was raised. My mom owned the Western Iowa store, and it was all about turning a profit daily. Everything we did was about cash flow, and the whole premise of every single day we went into that store was to turn a daily profit. And that's how we managed our cash flow. If we had a bunch of bills to pay and we didn't turn a profit that day, we would wait to pay those bills until we turned a profit and use that profit to pay the bills. So in this scenario, this was a dead wager. What I should have done, now granted it worked out, Indianapolis scored late, they ended up winning. $600 we roughly made there minus the $100 wager for Jets. We cleared $500 for that those two wagers. What I should have done, I should have wagered $200. The reason being, let's say the Jets win, so $200 we'd have won roughly $600. If the Jets win, 600 minus that 333, we'd clear roughly $250. So in that scenario, we would either win, and if Indianapolis hangs on to win, that's roughly $600 minus the $200 wager for the Jets would clear $400. So in the correct scenario, we are either going to win $400 or $250. Much smarter investment. The way that I structured it, we either win $500 or $0. You see what I'm saying? So the whole premise is when you're investing money into your sports betting, you never want to create a scenario, especially when you're hedging, to just break even. You should at least set it up so that if you're going to hedge something, it should be for profit. Even if it seems likely that there's no way that scenario, even if it's a long shot, and at the time it did seem like it was a long shot considering the Jets were down 13 points, you still want to invest enough to make profit on that specific wager. So that is an example of the dead wager and why you should avoid it. Okay, let's talk about NFL here. Now the model we've had a ton of success with this NFL model and the way I've approached it, really low volume. In the last, you can see the weeks 10, 11, 12, we haven't wagered a lot. We went 5-2 and we're up 6.05 units. So that makes us profitable for NFL year to date. And I pull this up, we're 17-17, up 3.36 units. And as I said at the beginning of the year, if you can clear 10 units with NFL and college football combined, a very short season, that would be a very, very successful season. Still in the hole with NCAA football, but I feel like we could have maybe not hit 10 units with NFL, but at least get it close to that, maybe 7 or 8 units, because we have roughly, 2.5 months left in NFL. But I really like this model and the approach of how I'm handicapping NFL. And while we're on that, I want to show you something from yesterday. I think this is real important. I had a client ask about this, and I'm going to review this for you. Let me pull this up on the screen here. It was the Atlanta game. Now with the Atlanta, let's make sure you guys can see this. Yep. Okay, with Atlanta and Denver, we actually had Atlanta as the favorite in this game. However, I want you to pay close attention to this. The Atlanta line, it was basically Denver blew Atlanta out. Look at that opening line of -2. Okay, very simple lesson. It closed at +2. Now, the only way I would have played Atlanta would be if that line had dipped back to, you can see bookmaker there had it at 2, and it never came off at 2. In fact, early in the week, it was at -1.5, and then it bumped to 2, and it never came off that 2 ever. So I've said this before, if the Atlanta was a good wager, then why did the line at least move back to say +1.5? So that was why I didn't play Atlanta there. And I think that's really important when you're understanding line movement from the macro. If that line opened at -2 and closed at +2, there's a reason for that. And that line moved relatively quick early in the week, and it didn't move off of that 2. And as we've learned in understanding line movement, and I learned this from my mentor, if there's no movement on the line, more times than not, that favors the favorite. So that was a clear indication based on that why I chose not to play at Atlanta. And of course, it was a good decision, and Atlanta got blown out. Okay, let's go to NBA. And what I'm going to show you is my lines from yesterday, which was 11-17. We only had one play, and it was a winner. I think you saw it on that previous screen, Houston, that we could have played a lot more volume. And I'm going to talk about the changes that I made to this model and how I'm handicapping. Now, the old way that I handicapped this was I would only play teams that were double-digit favorites via my line. For example, so the ones I would consider: Minnesota -11, Cleveland -18, Detroit -15, Memphis -10, Houston -15, and maybe even Clippers -10. In addition to that, I made the criteria even stricter, meaning I wanted at least a 5-point differential between my line and the books line. Now, if you look at Minnesota was -8.5, and let's go look at the line from yesterday. You can see there Minnesota was -7.5, so almost 5 points of value. And if I would have wagered Minnesota in that scenario yesterday, they would have lost. Now, something else to think about, and hopefully I can explain this where it's not too deep. A lot of times my mind thinks extremely complicated, and it's very difficult for me to say what my brain is thinking. The average margin of victory in NBA is 11 points. That means on average, an NBA team wins by 11. So that means you'll have scenarios where teams are winning by, -15, -20, and you also have scenarios where they're winning by less. So what I'm trying to do is I want to stay closer to that 5-point line, meaning like the max I want to play would be like a -5.5, -6 line, and in a lot of cases, even less than that. And there's several reasons behind this. Let's say if I'm wagering a -3 game, in a -3 game, let's say I'm playing the favorite -3. For NBA, that's basically one possession. So I still have an opportunity to hedge out. See what I'm saying? Whereas even playing on the spread, because a lot of times in hedging, like you saw in that previous example, if you play a dog, that team goes up, you're able to play money line dog for the opposite side with an easy hedge. Whereas NBA, a little bit more difficult when you're playing a favorite, but if that number is low enough, it's gonna create a hedging scenario. So the first sort of change that I made, I want to play those lines that are closer to, say, 5.5, 6, and then let me see if I can show you the betting log here for NBA. Yeah, this is us year to date, 5-3, and we won our last 4. I know it's a small sample size, I get that, but I've been very, very cautious with my approach to NBA. And I think Knicks, Golden State, Orlando, Houston, all of those wagers we've had, those last 4 wagers have been relatively small lines. All right, so let's go back and look at this. Now, Miami and Indiana, when you see it, like my line was -108, that's basically what I call a 50-50 game. Now, you're looking at the line. Whoops. Let me pull this up. Hopefully I've been. Okay, here we go. All right, so if you see there Miami and Indiana, if it was a 50-50 game, why didn't we play Miami? Look at that line, -2.5 open and closed at -3.5. So I definitely want to have neutral line movement, meaning no line movement, or I want to have some line movement in my favor there. So therefore, that's why I didn't play that one. You look at the Charlotte and Cleveland, we had my line for that. We had Cleveland -18. You take a look at the books line was -10. So even though Cleveland covered, for me, again, I want to wager, only invest in games where that books line is closer to, say, that -5.5, -6 line. Now, the one we should have played, I was just late looking at this. Take a look at Detroit and Washington. We'll go back to my line here. You can see Detroit was -15. So the books line, this is important. Look at the books line. Books line was 5.5. So we're getting, 9.5 points of value or 9.5 point differential between my line and the book's line. So we had really good margin, and it was a relatively low number, and that was a huge blowout win for Detroit there. And again, that line basically stayed at 5.5, opened at 5.5, stayed at 5.5. More times than not, that favors the favorite. So Detroit would have been a good play. And next, take a look at Denver and Memphis. And this is another good scenario to talk about. Notice that line opened at -2. Again, the way that I handicap, it's very pretty much centered around the model itself. So I couldn't tell you if there was an injury, but more than likely there was maybe a player that was really good for Denver that sat out, because you can see the line opened at -2. It ended up closing at -6. I like to avoid those games the majority of the time. Sometimes there might be a case where you can play it, but that's basically a 4-point swing. Usually that's a prime example of a public line movement and not sharp, meaning the public and everybody knows why that line is moving. Maybe there was a really good score for Denver that was out, and that line moved from -2 always to -6. So in my opinion, there wasn't sufficient enough value, and I generally don't like to play those games because it's a quote public line move. But nonetheless, my line had Memphis -10, and they won and covered. Now, this is an interesting one here for Atlanta and Portland, and we'll go back to my model here. Atlanta and Portland, take a look at my line there, -2 for Atlanta. Now, you might have heard me use the term margin of error. I like to use that term as opposed to some people use this term called standard deviation. In essence, if I'm looking at my model and I have Atlanta -2, that line could be -3, Atlanta -1. So when it's that close, I mean, it's only 2-point differential between the two teams, I'm going to basically classify that game as a 50-50 game. And what that means is, via my model, I view both these teams have an equal opportunity to win. So therefore, if we can get, say, +120 on the dog, that would be the play reason you would want +20. If you win, hypothetically, I talk about expected value. Those teams play each other 10 times. The dog wins 5 of those. The favorite wins 5. You would lose 500. You take +120 times 5. I'll do it on my calculator. +120 times 5. That's $600. So just using a $100 example, you win $100. You invest $1,000. That's a 10% ROI, which is a good investment in sports betting. So therefore, let's go back and look at the actual game. And Portland won that. Opened at 5, ended up closing at 4. I think that line was 3.5, and it did bump to 4 late. So I do want to look at late movement as well. But nonetheless, Portland did win, and I'll show you that as well. So there's 2 ways to really assess line movement. You can look at the way I showed you, looking at open and close. And you can also look at late movement as well. That's probably not a good example. Let me see if I can. That was Bookmaker. Let's look at Pinnacle. And the website I'm looking at, if you're new, is bookmakersreview.com. It's completely free, and it's really, in essence, all that I use. All right, so, take a look. That line was 3.5, and then bumped to 4 late in favor of Atlanta. So that was another reason why I didn't play this game. So I'm very discreet with my handicapping with NBA. But the reason I'm showing this is to show you how really strong this model is. All right, let's keep going. In Brooklyn and New York, Knicks were -10 via my line. Book's line, same line. So depending on the book, they barely covered if you could get -9. Again, no value. Another game we did play, you take a look. Let me show you my line here, back over here. Houston was -15 my line. Book's line was getting -4.5. So we had a 11, basically a 10.5 point differential. Again, that line's closer to that amount that I'm comfortable with. And it was basically a huge win for Houston there, blowout win. And notice that line opened at -4, and then it closed at 4.5. So we did have some positive line movement from open to close. And let's see what else we got. So again, I'm really excited about the way that we're handicapping with the model. The problem is with these big margins, my line, a lot of times the books line, especially with like Cleveland, my line was minus 18, books line minus 10, not enough significant margin. So I want to have, a pretty big margin, or in the case would say the Denver-Memphis game where it's a small number to cover, because my line for Memphis was minus 10, books had it at minus 6. So that's right around that, number that I like to play, maybe a little bit lower than that. So really excited about NBA, and I feel good. Like we can really come close to maybe like 10 units before the end of the year. A lot of action in NBA. It's November the 18th, so we have roughly a month and a half to get there. So excited about that. And then go ahead and show you these last two lines, Dallas and Oklahoma City. My line was minus 8 for OKC. And then it was for LA Clippers minus 10, so there's going to be no value. Take a look, OKC was minus 7.5, so that basically saved us a loss there. And then Clippers were basically minus 10, same as the books line, no value, even though they did cover. So really excited, and I feel like I'm getting in a rhythm with NBA, and probably more confident with NBA than any other NBA and NFL right now, as far as any other matter that we have going on for the fall. All right, finally, I want to review and show you make sure I have this. I want to show where we are unit-wise year to date. Absolutely gotten destroyed here to start NHL season. I did make one small error with the model that I've already corrected, and going to do a little bit of back testing, because I think in doing that, I found like a very simple approach to handicapping NHL, and still feel confident we'll have a successful NHL season, even though we've had a really rough start. You can see soccer, we were in the hole, came back. NBA 3 units, NCAA football up 10 units, and lost that all the way down to minus 5. NFL in the hole, we came back and feel like we can get maybe that 10 units to finish out year to date, but definitely close to it. And of course, MLB and NHL combined roughly about 55 units. So year to date, unit wise, we're at 47.46 units. So if you're new to the podcast, we basically grade one play as 1 unit, which is the correct way to grade units. My goal for the end of the year, I originally said, I think I posted this on Instagram, was like 50 units, but I really feel like we can get 13 units in before the year to date. So to finish the year at 60 units would be really, really a solid 2024 season. And my primary focus is probably, even though I'm going to fix this model with NHL, my focus is going to be definitely NBA and NFL. NBA is a sport we can wager on every single day. I think you need to have, one of those sports, whether it's hockey, whether it's NBA, whether it's NHL, a sport that's played every day. You can develop a rhythm in your handicapping and stay sharp that way. And that's where I feel like I am with NBA. So I'm going to really focus on NBA. And I think we can definitely 60 is doable before the end of the year. So super excited about that. Greatly appreciate you guys tuning in to this podcast. And I've got a lot of content coming out this week. Like if you're watching on YouTube, and subscribe to the channel. Ton of content related to sports betting. Talk to you guys next week. Peace.